Good evening. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of our Dean, Professor Reza Daniels. Please rise for the academic procession.
So good evening, everyone. You may be seated. Thank you. So let's just make sure everybody has a seat. So good evening once again. My name is Sibusisa Moyo. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research, Innovation, and Internationalization. And it gives me great pleasure to do the welcome today for the professorial inaugural lecture by Professor Reza Daniels. So I want to just make a few acknowledgements. You can see that today actually we have one of the best attendances at an inaugural lecture, and I think maybe the title must have been very interesting for most people. So so I just want to acknowledge members of the Rectorate who are present, and including I think our new Vice Chancellor, DVC for Academic, Professor Lizo van Dijk, who's joining us for the first time for this lecture. And then we also have Professor Nicholas Smith, who's both our COO and Chief Financial Officer. And then we have also Dr. Ronel Retif, who is our registrar and one of the most important people we have in the university. I guess the students will tell you that. And then our former DVC, Professor Nico Koopman. I know I'm scared of your new portfolio. He now has a new portfolio, which is the Chief People Officer. Yeah, different from COO. But thank you for joining us. And then, of course, our Dean of Students, Dr. Van Roy, who's with us as well. And then we've got the deans from our 10 faculties who are present with us. I'll just not mention the names, so I want to observe all the protocols of our deans and vice deans, research, teaching, and learning who are present, members of the management team who are present, our students, alumni, friends, family, members who are present, board members from the advisory board of the faculty, our donors, partners, and those, of course, who are joining us via the live stream. So, I must extend a special welcome to the friends and family of Professor Daniels, specifically his wife, Tanya, who's on my right. That's the first row. The first and second row, that's family, so our family members who are present. So we've got Tanya and the children, Kieran and Michaela. And then the parents, Andre and Masha. Where's Andre and Masha? I saw them. Cool. Yeah, welcome. They were the most enthusiastic guests tonight, so we just want to welcome you and congratulate you for tonight as well. And then we have those who have traveled, of course, from the US, who are with us today in person. So we've got the siblings, Nicole, Sasha, who has also traveled from the USA to be here in person, and then Yuri, who's attending online from the US as well. So the loved ones are Peter, Ajwaluna and Zara, who are also here with us. And then there's Rachel, Layla, and Alex, who are attending online in New Zealand. And then Kelly, Killian, and Enzo, who are also attending online in the US. I must also then mention the former executive, the deans for the Economic Management Sciences who are present with us today. Professor Estjen Kalitz in person. Where's Prof. Kalis? I thought I saw him. There you go. Thank you so much for joining us. And then Professor Johan de Villiers online. Professor Stan Duplessis, who's here in person. Thank you so much for joining us as well. And then Professor Ingrid Woolard, who's also online. I was also met by the group of students who joined us today. You see, I think those students in jackets on the right-hand side that you see, from the Economic Business Sciences Student Committee who are present. So I just want to welcome you as well and really thank you for joining us tonight. And then, of course, I just want to say, so if I've left out your name, please forgive me. All protocols observed, right? You are all very special, and without you, we wouldn't be here. So I just want to acknowledge you once again. It is, of course, my great pleasure to welcome you to the university for this inaugural lecture today by Professor Reza Daniels, the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. Tonight's event for us is an important milestone in the academic life of our university and our professors. We know that professorial inaugural lectures provide an opportunity not only to celebrate the achievements of a scholar who has attained the rank of professor, but also to reflect on how their research, academic work, and thought leadership impact society in a transformational way and contributes to the advancement of knowledge and the economy. We gather at a time when societies, we know, across the world face increasingly complex challenges. Economic inequality, unemployment, environmental uncertainty, technological disruption, and questions around how data and theory should inform public policy. In this context, the role of institutions of higher learning has never been more important. Our responsibility is not simply to produce knowledge, but to ensure that knowledge is rigorous, relevant, and responsive to society's needs. So Professor Daniels' lecture today, you see the title, which is just amazing, Data plus Theory is equal to Policy. So I'm a mathematician by background, so I wanted to add D plus T equals P. I couldn't see the meaning. But, and it also focuses on the applied economists' epistemological challenge and asks profoundly important questions. For example, how do economists know what they think they know? And how can we ensure that the data that we observe, the theories we apply, and the policies we design genuinely improve people's lives? So these questions inform, of course, the faculty's commitment to research excellence and societal impact. They challenge us to think critically about evidence, to interrogate assumptions that we make, and to recognize that meaningful research and policy-focused interventions emerge when scholarship remains connected to the lived realities experienced by communities, institutions, and economies. Professor Daniels exemplifies this commitment. As Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, he provides, of course, the strategic leadership to the university's largest faculty in terms of student numbers. He is also a highly respected scholar whose research has contributed significantly to our understanding of labor markets, inequality, earnings, wealth, innovation, and economic development. His work has informed rigorous academic debates, public discourse, and policy conversations both nationally and internationally. Professor Reza Daniels, this evening we celebrate not only your scholarly achievements, but also your leadership, your commitment to the university, and your contribution to building a more inclusive, just, and prosperous society through research and evidence-based engagement. And that's why the data today becomes important. We thank you for sharing your insights with us tonight, and we look forward to the ideas, questions, and discussions that your lecture will undoubtedly inspire tonight. It is now my pleasure to invite Professor Dieter von Fittel, who's the Vice Dean Research, Postgraduate Affairs and Internationalization in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, to formally introduce Professor Reza Daniels. Thank you also to the support teams that have helped us tonight to make all the logistical arrangements. I want to thank them in advance and thank each one of you for coming and joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moyo. Good evening, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Rectorate, Deanery, Chief Senior Directors, students, alumni, donors, friends, family members, and also those joining us online. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Reza Daniels as he delivers his professorial inaugural lecture this evening. An inaugural lecture is a special occasion in the journey of any scholar. We come together to celebrate academic excellence, and we also pause to reflect on the ideas, questions, and commitments that have defined a very rich career. It is made even more special when we give this platform here today to a colleague who also leads our faculty. Reza currently serves as Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University. He's also an honorary professor in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He completed his studies at 3 internationally renowned universities, Auckland, Michigan, Cape Town, and these all culminated in a PhD in economics. Along the way, he developed quite a powerful combination of expertise in development studies, survey methodology, and applied economics, disciplines that continue to shape his approach to research today. Those of us who work in economics know that policy evidence is only as good as the data on which it rests, right? So Reza has consistently championed the importance of data quality, not simply as a technical concern, but also as a matter of fairness and also for the purposes of good governance. Poor data lead to poor decisions. Good data create opportunities for better policy and ultimately for better lives of the people who benefit from those policies. His work as principal investigator of the profoundly important decade-long National Income Dynamics Study and also of its spin-off, the NIDS Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, or as many of us know it, NIDS CRAM, during the COVID-19 pandemic, exemplified this commitment. It provided policymakers with very timely evidence during one of South Africa's most challenging periods in modern history. Researchers are indebted to him and also to the NIDS team for creating and maintaining this invaluable public research good. Over the course of more than 2 decades, his research has addressed a wide range of issues. As Prof. Moyer has mentioned, they include labor markets, earnings, wealth, poverty, inequality, innovation, informality, economic development, public policy, and also more recently, as his latest publication in Nature Communications demonstrates, also environmental economics. His work has consistently engaged with some of South Africa's most pressing societal and economic challenges while contributing to international scholarly debates. His career has also been characterized by leadership, as we know. Before joining Stellenbosch, he led the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He directed the Southern African Labour and Development Research, or SALDRU as it's commonly known, one of the continent's leading centres for research on poverty, inequality and economic development. Beyond academia, he has advised governments, international organisations, development banks and the private sector, ensuring that scholarship finds its way into practical decision-making that ultimately improves lives on the ground. In 2024, he was appointed to the Academy of Science of South Africa's Standing Committee on Science for the Reduction of Poverty and Inequality, and earlier this year joined the Bioeconomy Audit Committee of the National Advisory Council on Innovation. These roles reflect the high regard in which his expertise is held both within and beyond academia. As colleagues in this faculty, we've also come to know Reza as a strategic and also a thoughtful leader who values intellectual debate, evidence-based decision-making, and academic excellence. He has brought these qualities to his leadership of EMS and also to the broader university community. This evening's literature, if we can call it D plus T is equal to P, if I use Prof. Moyer's terminology, brings together many of the themes that have characterized his scholarly work. The lecture asks an important question. How do economists know what they think they know? I'd love to find that out, being an economist myself. It challenges us to think critically about the relationship between data, theory, and policy, and it reminds us that good policy depends not only on good intentions, but also on the good evidence that researchers produce. For those of us who work in universities, this is a powerful reminder that knowledge creation is not simply about producing answers and putting them in journals. It's also about constantly asking new and better questions to help us move our society forward. Reza's work has constantly demonstrated the importance of doing both the asking and the answering. So, Reza, tonight we celebrate your achievements as an economist, as a scholar, as a leader, and also as our colleague. We celebrate your ongoing contribution to the advancement of knowledge and to the role that universities can play in addressing the challenges that particularly South African society faces. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Reza Daniels to deliver his professorial inaugural lecture.
Thanks so much, colleagues and friends. Thank you, Dieter and Professor Moyo, for the introduction and the very kind and generous words. It's an honor to be here this evening to share this moment with my family who've traveled, with my wife Tanya, Kieran and Michaela, who are my constant companions. And of course, an academic career is not just built in the immediate here now, but over time. And so for that, I have to thank my parents who've always encouraged us all to be critical thinkers, to never accept what we see as doctrine or something that shouldn't be challenged. I think from the time we were kids, they led by example in that respect. And so I'm also very grateful for their influence. And of course, my siblings, Sasha, Nicole, and Yuri, who's online, all of us have many violent arguments from time to time, inspired by my parents and our broader family, Ralph, Catherine, and all of the families that are also online who've been very much part of the journey of my parents, of us. And so it's a real privilege to be here. I have set a deliberately provocative title, partly because I've found that the challenges that economists face can be very complex, very multidisciplinary. You need lots of hard maths and stat skills, but you also need the social sciences, sociology, politics, anthropology sometimes, especially in developing economies. Those are all fundamental components of building up your skill set as an applied economist. And so I found that the discipline can be very challenging. And if you, as an academic in particular, who is tasked with having to teach and having to ensure that you are up to date with the literature, you very frequently have to find yourself going to explore new disciplines. And partly the skills that we teach students is an exportable skill in the sense that any time you don't understand something, the real value of a university education is that you then get equipped with the skills to go and figure it out by yourself. Right? There's lots of literature out there, lots of smart people out there, and increasingly it's easy to access alternative ways of thinking, doing things, and the like. And so the university academic journey for a PhD student is particularly about ensuring that you can use methods to conduct research that is important, and we usually think that publishing that research is important. But the academic journey thereafter is about augmenting those skills, right? And it's about accepting rejections when you submit your articles for publication the first time round. So the process of critique, engagement, review, rejection, going back, questioning yourself, solving the problems, resubmitting, potentially eventually getting accepted for your publications, is the discipline, the rigor of the discipline that we have to go through. So the epistemic foundations of our knowledge are constantly being questioned as academics. And this, I think, is what I've tried to distill my work around. So, I'm going to, in this lecture, firstly talk about what it is that economists do. I know a lot of people in the room don't know, including very close family members. I'm then going to ask the question, well, what's the epistemological challenge they face, which means how do we know what we know? Then I'm going to introduce three forms of what I'm going to call epistemic loss, ways in which our reasoning might falter. Okay? And the one is going to be theoretical determinism, in other words, using theory to think of a solution without necessarily the supporting data or other information. The second would be data limitations, and here I'm going to think about things like data mining and what the dangers of that might be. And then I'm going to look at policy determinism. And then what my proposition is here is that when you have these epistemic losses, the data and theory you use may never be sufficient for good policy. Right? And similarly, if you're just doing policy ad hoc, you might find that this has all kinds of implications for data and theory. And in a world where we're increasingly seeing leaders make decisions that are arbitrary, frequently policy has absolutely nothing to do with data and theory, and we have to figure it out. Because they create failures, they create government failures, they can exacerbate market failures or network failures, and then we often ask to come along and solve the problem. So then how do we do it? So I'm going to then focus on what my work has done in these three domains to sort of contribute where it has contributed, and then I'll think more generally about the implications for growth and development policy. Okay, so economists are often asked to help economies grow or to prevent economic decline. This could be for any number of reasons, right? But good advice depends more on, you don't just need theoretical coherence or good data and technical models. You also need to think very carefully about what are the underlying conditions that you need to understand, the context, in other words, right? And what are the social, political, and economic order? What is the social, political, and economic order? If you have a very authoritarian government, no matter what you know and how good you are as an economist, it'll always be trumped by what the policymaker who has political power can do, and it might not make much sense. But for us, as economists, and particular academic research economists, that's something we must never accept, right? We always need to ensure what we're doing has integrity. So there are three failures, or three types of failures that are going to be present in any economy at any given time. And I'm going to summarize these as market failures, government failures, and network failures. Examples of these with market failures are externalities. So if you have, for example, waste, you throw waste away, but waste actually has value. There's no rands and cents associated with it, though, so it's considered something that might be causing pollution and externality, not factored into the cost of the good. Okay? Could be a missing market. Waste is often thought of as a missing market because there's no obvious demand for it. It often gets dumped in landfills, suggesting no value. There might be information gaps, or there might be market powers. If there's a monopolist, they can, in fact, exert that market power and abuse their authority. Government failures include weak capacity, so you can't necessarily implement well. It might be state capture. We know a lot about that in South Africa. There might be poor targeting, so difficult to reach the kinds of groups you intend. And there might be impediments to learning. There might be ideological reasons for this. There might be all kinds of reasons for this, and that we need to figure out. And then there's something called network failure. So network failure has to do with things like weak coordination between parties. If, for example, you have people who demand a good and people who supply a good, but no coordination between them, your markets might not function as well. You might also have missing linkages between agents that are important in an economy. Very importantly, you might also have low trust. Okay? So South Africa post-1994, we had low trust. South Africa in 2026, we have low trust. Okay? It's a very, very serious implication for the way our society works. And we might have poor learning systems. And this might be just the way in which we assimilate information might be highly unequal, in which case very few people have access to the learning systems. Or it just could be poor learning for any other type of reason. And these failures interact. So market failure can cause government responses which are inappropriate, network constraints, and learning failure. And this can just reinforce itself. So then it just kind of means that you're never able to get out of the difficult problems that you face. And ideally, a policy must reduce the original problem. So the reason we focus so much on policy is because it is the intervention that can make a difference, that can potentially solve any one of these failures if the policy is appropriate, right? Or it can exacerbate them. Okay, so the epistemological challenge in plain language is effectively thus. The economy is not observed directly. We have data, we have theory, right? We observe prices, quantities, administrative records, we observe behaviors. And at the same time, we have theories about how these work. So we try and figure things out and we try and link these all together. And the challenge is really to connect these observed traces to the underlying conditions and connect those to policies that can improve our society. So I'm going to use this diagram from Ariel Spanos. His book, The Statistical Foundations of Econometric Modeling, was actually a book that was recommended to me by Stan when we were both at the African Econometric Society, standing at the Cambridge University Press bookstore, but bewildered by the complexity of the work that was there and finding and searching very hard for solutions. And he said to me, buy that book, it's very good. So I bought it. And of course, it became sort of a foundation for me for a lot of the work that I did. Anyway, this is a really nice way in which Spanos describes how we move from theory through to theoretical modeling, econometric modeling, which is where we then take the important parts of how an economy works and we link that to the theory, but we also say, well, how does that mean I estimate something? We then get data. We have to think about the form of statistical inference that is relevant. And from there, we can do two things. Okay? We can forecast. So if you're going to be looking at prices, for example, or stock market prices, then your interest is going to be about forecasting what happens next. Or the alternative is that you can evaluate policy. You can assess, has something worked, has it not? Is there an obvious gap that the policy can solve or not? Right? Sometimes you don't want to create policy. The market might be able to do it better than any intervention might. And then you need to know when and why. Okay? So this is not a linear process as much as the arrow suggests, because once you learn, you can, of course, feed that back into theory. Or you can feed it back into your model or into the process by which you estimate and think about what it is you're trying to solve. So my work, and which is why I'm going to look at those three epistemic problems, my work has traditionally focused a lot around this, but I've also done some work here, and then a lot of combining and thinking about how all this works. And so let me now move to thinking through what that means for policy. Okay, so the question then is, what's the real conditions we care about? What does economic theory have to say about it? How is that condition measured? Right? How does that measurement condition become data? And then how do we develop potential solutions? So, we'll go through a range of different, and I'll show some of the published work that matches this. But the idea is effectively that we're always going to come back to that sort of mental map, which is this diagram. Okay? Now, this diagram is slightly different from Spanos because now I'm going to consider the first form of epistemological loss, which is theoretical determinism. So what is that? Okay, if we, for example, just use theory to come up with policy, that's an example of theoretical determinism. Doesn't necessarily mean you'll always be wrong. So we know, for example, if you set prices below the market clearing price, we don't need data, you're going to get a shortage in the market. Okay, most recent country to do that was Zimbabwe in the 2000s, where they tried to, because of inflation going up so quickly, they tried to put a brake on prices to say, wait a second, people can't afford this, they need to be able to afford food. But the price was below the cost of production, so demand was always going to exceed supply. We don't need data then. Theory solves the problem. It's going to lead to a shortage. It did, and there were no goods on the shelf. but more complex problems will require data. Okay, so theoretical determinism is not necessarily an epistemological loss if you're dealing with prices in a market, but it certainly might be if you're dealing with unemployment, which is a much more complex issue. So this is one way in which you can lose your reasoning that a model might suggest. Okay, so let's just see. Now, economists have many different ways of thinking. This is a short summary of the schools of thought in economics by Ha-Jun Chang. And you can see here a range of different schools of thought. We have classical, neoclassical, Marxist, developmentalist, Austrian, Schumpeterian, Keynesian, institutionalist, and behavioralist. And each of these schools of thought will have different ideas about the role of individuals, how the world works, what the most important domain of the economy is, how economies change, what policy predictions come from that theory, what the strengths of the particular theory might be, and the weaknesses. Okay? And as we know, you'll have very different views between Marxists, for example, and those who believe in neoclassical economics, because they are generally thought of as antithetical. So the policy prescriptions might also be vastly different. So for example, we can see here, everything from socialist revolutionary central planning to free marketeers is within the economists' theoretical purview. Okay. Now, of course, it's not just schools of thought which can be very benign and a very nice academic discourse, but these schools of thought map towards political parties' policy agendas. Right? And this is why it becomes really important for economic students and economists who are doing work to make their theoretical assumptions explicit, because it kind of leads to us helping to understand how it is that they're reasoning, and then to model honestly and to try and address these questions and assess what is the right way forward. So what's my contribution been in the domain of theory? So what's less known about my work is that I did spend a lot of time, and still do, working to confront issues that have to do with pollution and waste. I have had to then think very carefully about greenhouse gas pricing, and was part of a very big international consortium that tried to address this. We came up with a range of different instruments for the Asian Development Bank in 2021, which was looking at using market-based approaches to environmental management in Asia. And this market-based approaches are distinct from command and control. So the Chinese government, for example, has some of the most stringent environmental legislation in the world because they have the highest levels of pollution in many of their cities. And as a consequence, you have very strong disciplinary policies. And so encouraging markets to be effective there means thinking much more carefully about, well, how do you get air pollution down voluntarily with producers and consumers. So that's one. And then we also wrote a paper on funding inclusive green transition through greenhouse gas pricing. This had to deal with the role of carbon taxes. If we put another tax on an economy, does it impact the poor disproportionately or the wealthy? And there are ways of measuring that. But that was also impacted years ago by two papers I wrote with the Energy Research Center colleagues, which was Faika Hartley and Tara Sitano on the general equilibrium impacts of monetizing all waste streams in South Africa and the economic benefits of extended producer responsibility. These formed a lot of work which was in a commercial setting, so it was proprietary and not publishable. But nonetheless, one of the things we did do is we clarified how you can, in South Africa at least, unlock a lot of value by valorizing waste. This I ended up developing into a PhD and master's course on the economics of waste, which I taught at the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi in 2020. So it was about effectively recognizing that, sorry, I'm not moving in the direction I'm intending. Okay. Yeah, so it was about recognizing that theory didn't have all the answers when it came to something like waste, and we had to develop new theory. Okay, so that was why I'm saying that's a form of epistemic work because you're figuring out what theory can't solve. Okay, so then the next epistemic loss is data mining. So what is data mining? So data mining is when you take any source of data you might have and you go directly into either trying to forecast or trying to create policy on it. Now, you can often do this quite successfully within the context of an investment vehicle, because you really don't need to know what's going on as long as your model predicts the next day's prices, and if it does that well, you can make a lot of money, right? But when we're teaching this stuff, you kind of can't really rest on that as a foundation for our students to learn investment strategies, right? Or even to think about how to model policy. So data has real risks. And part of the reason for then looking at data quality is to understand, well, if this data is not measuring stuff well enough, then all that money you might be investing in something might be really risky because the data is not going to reflect the true conditions, and then the return you get is going to be totally different to what you expect for a reason you can't explain. Okay? And so for me, I've done a lot of work with this in the context of the National Income Dynamics Study, where we were looking at longitudinal data monitoring how South Africa was evolving. And two of my colleagues, Tim and Kim, are in the audience here tonight from NIDS and from SALDRU. Spent a good 15 years working with them and trying to unpack all of this stuff. So let me share then what we've sort of were forced to confront. If you're data mining with microdata, so that's dealing with firms or dealing with individuals or households, you face several risks in the data production process, right? So statisticians call this a DGP, a data generating process. So what I've done here is I've kind of tried to map that into what the data producing agency will be able to control. So that's the data quality components that, let's say, Stats SA or any other, the Bureau of Economic Research, for example, might be able to influence. And that has to do with the relevance of the data, the timeliness, accessibility, interpretability, coherence, integrity, and soundness. Any one of these might be compromised at any given point just because your budget's low. Okay, so if you have a low budget, your methodological soundness is going to be weaker, right? But you might also then be focused on getting the data out quickly, which might be more important to your clients or your investors, okay, because they'll do something else with it. Nevertheless, that's going to impact the accuracy of your data, and that means if you're using it for academic and policy purposes, there are other things to be considered. What is also going to be something you have to consider carefully is about whether you have construct validity, right? Measurement error or processing error in the data. So are you measuring the things you want, or are there systematic components of error? And then lastly, are you covering the population you think you're covering well? Okay, so in South Africa, this was a big deal around the time of 1994 because we were reintegrating the former Bantustans. So our censuses were out of whack. The count of people, the count of everything had not formally included that until after 1994. And the 1996 census was the first time we got a very good sense of what's happening here. Okay? And that also means any policy comparison between, let's say, 1995 and 2000 is very difficult to do because the 1995 data in Stats SA had not yet adjusted the sampling frame to ensure that the historical Bantustans were now included into South Africa. And it caused a lot of chaos when I was actually beginning my PhD because everyone was saying that the new ANC government had not actually reduced poverty. In fact, if you compared the 1995 October household survey with the 2000 one, it looked like poverty increased. And it was people like Sefas van der Berg who came and thought very carefully about the fact that actually that can't be true if you've also got a fiscal policy system that's increased the welfare and the grants of individuals, because then you're missing out on a big part of what's happening in the policy domain. And policy can't possibly mean that poverty has gone up. And in fact, that was true. So we figured out later with different weighting techniques how you can adjust this. So for me, my work in this area addressed this epistemological question very directly. I looked a lot at how data quality affects our understanding of the earnings distribution. I wrote a book on it. I taught that book as a masterclass at the University of Paris. And that was very intense class over the course of a week. But I also did work with Tim and Kim in the room on things like attrition. We looked at a lot of data, sort of technical details, because if you didn't fully understand what was happening in the data due to people dropping out, then you would falsely conclude what was happening in the economy. And then Tim also created this fantastic algorithm for solving incorrect GPS coordinates, and we worked quite hard on that too on our Saturdays, because it was really important to ensure that where we were locating schools or individuals or firms was actually not in the middle of the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. And unfortunately, data quality was really variable at the time, so that was a really important contribution there. The last one I want to cover as a form of epistemic loss is what I'll call policy determinism. And so now you'll note that I've changed this block, and instead of saying forecasting, policy evaluation, I'm saying policy impact and response. And I'm drawing an arrow this way now back to theory. So why am I doing this? I'm doing this partly because when you start dealing with systemic threats to societies like COVID-19 or like environmental catastrophes, then we don't have good theory nor good data to know what to do. And COVID was the first time that we were confronted with something as dramatic as this. So what I'm plotting now is South Africa's policy response to COVID. And I'm going to tell you the source of data in a moment, but it's a source of data that looks at policies and it groups them into a few aggregate measures called stringency, government response, containment, and health and economic support. So these are all policies that were developed by the South African government to manage COVID-19 between the years, or rather months of February 2020 to November 2022. Okay? And we'll see here that these indices, and they compiled internationally by the Oxford Policy Response Group, and they are all defined, and all of the data is open access, so you can all get hold of it. But when you plot that, you'll see that immediately we went, after the discovery of COVID, into stage 5, lockdown, right? Everyone will remember that. It caused us all dramatic mental health problems, and we couldn't drink nor smoke to alleviate those problems, so everything was even worse. Nonetheless, during that time, the South African government experimented with central planning. Okay, so that was effectively giving them a blank check to be a Marxist sort of central planning state, if you wish. They banned the sale of all kinds of goods, like summer clothing, in order to restrict movements of people in what was thought to be the appropriate epidemiological and public health response. Okay, but at the same time, everyone else around the world was doing different things. And so there were different policy responses globally, and everyone was trying to figure out what's the best way to handle this. We were confronted with very high mortality statistics. And so partly, these stringency and government response indices are highest initially because we don't know what to do, and then we learn a little bit, right? And then the next wave hits when the Delta virus, I think, Delta strand that was discovered here at Stellenbosch University, when that one also caused lots of mortality, right? So our stringency went up again, and then slowly but surely, partly because of NIDS cram and us telling them, stop doing this, they began to ease off a little bit on the policies. And so why were we doing that? We were doing that because the economic consequences were dramatic. You might have had some public health benefits, but by that stage you'd lost so much unemployment that you were really just pushing the economy to breaking point. So then when we sit back and we reflect, well, what happened? What were the different policy responses? We can use this Oxford Government Policy Response Tracker policy document, which globally benchmarks nearly 200 countries' policy responses to COVID, and we can rank them. So what I've done here is I've ranked them on an average index score, so using the same stringency, that's how stringent our policies are, how responsive our government is, what the containment and health policies are, and what economic support is. And then we can compare them to global benchmarks. So, what we figured out is that Sweden was among the more milder countries in terms of their COVID policies, whereas China was among the more dramatic and more interventionist. So if we benchmark South Africa's performance, and often people think we were much more similar to China. In terms of stringency, we were actually more similar to Sweden, right? In terms of our government response, yes, we were proactive, but so were the Swedish and so were the Chinese, right? In terms of our economic support, we were even more generous than the Swedes and closer towards the Chinese government. And in terms of containment and health, you'll see we're somewhere between the middle, but very much along the lines of what the global median would be, which is the gray bar. Okay, so this is an example where we don't have the tools theoretically or in terms of data to figure stuff out. And the one thing we want to be very, very careful about is that we don't take this ad hoc response here and then start ex post rationalizing it, right? As saying, okay, well, we should do this now because this is what happened. Rather, the challenge is, from an epistemological point of view, is to go back here and say, what do you do when there's a crisis? What's going to be hit? And then how do you develop a more coherent and responsive set of policies so that you don't bring the economy to the point of breaking, which is what we nearly did. And we still haven't recovered. So colleagues, many other countries' unemployment rates, so for example, Spain and Portugal had also unemployment rates over 20%, like we did at the beginning of COVID. Right? They've gone back down into double digits, well, below 20, below 15, some below 10, whereas ours has stayed at 30% and above. So unemployment rates have never recovered. And so it's even more important for South Africa to think proactively about when the next shock hit, and they will hit. There will be another pandemic, and there will be more extreme climate events. Then we can't take from this and say, oh, somehow we're successful, because we were not. Right? The impact on our society was just too dramatic. So, effectively then, the work that I kind of contributed here was about thinking through very carefully if you're dealing with transitions to, for example, a just energy transition. You also have to think carefully about a just labor transition. So what happens to your workforce? In South Africa, we have a very mining-intensive industry and workforce. So what happens with the coal workers, right? How do we manage that transition? We can't just do it the way it's been done in many different sectors where there's no support given. We also think about the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa and what we can learn from a policy response. And Daniela Casal and I wrote the introduction to this special edition of Development Southern Africa, which profiled across many different things, from parental labor supply to the impact on firms, to the impacts of our grants. And then also just to think about what happens in some of our key markets when we impose these dramatic policy constraints. Tim, Kim, and myself were also part of, and are they still doing this work, trying to harmonize our data with the cross-national equivalence file, which is a file that takes all global longitudinal surveys among a range of countries that have them, and tries to say, how do we compare it so that we get better international comparisons? Okay? And so that's where we take what we've learned and we build the international connections, and we ensure we fund the data harmonization that allows us to make more meaningful impacts in this work. Okay, so my key argument is really that the epistemological challenge is to establish whether the link in the chain from theory to observation to policy conclusion is credible, whether it's logically coherent, free from ideological bias, and appropriate for the context, right? And we don't want to pretend that uncertainty is absent here. In fact, we want to model the uncertainty, and you can do that in many different ways, but it gives you insight about how that may exert influence on your conclusions. The implications for growth and development policy are effectively multifaceted. You can think of this when you're thinking of South Africa's skills constraints, our firm capability deficits, our finance constraints, our infrastructure failure, our institutional mistrust, and our transition burden, whether that be a just labor transition or just energy transition. And we always need to look at the symptoms behind what these challenges might be. At the same time, it's important not to discard theory along the way or become too blasé about it, because it forces us, the discipline of modeling something theoretically, forces us to clarify how we think something works and to put it on paper so that our thinking is transparent and critiquable. Right? It also disciplines our intuition, it reveals trade-offs, and it gives us some responses that we think can work. But it can't by itself prove that data are measuring the right things or guarantee that implementation of a policy might work, replace context, or remove uncertainty. And those are things we have to bring into the process, very intentionally. And that we do with context. Okay? So which constraint is binding? Who is visible or invisible in the data? Which institutions deliver or not? How firms and households respond? And whether policy can be sustained politically and socially. We might want to do something, but it might not be palatable to our population. South African population will definitely go out and strike when they are not happy. So when we do this well, one of the things I want to be very bullish about is it's not to discourage one or get one overly cautious. It's to say, measure things better, we learn as we do, model it honestly, and then, most importantly, experiment boldly, right? Take what we've learned to the best in which we can learn it, and then go and say, okay, we are going to challenge and take on the big, grand challenges that South Africa has, because we're confident enough that what we know, how we know it, is sufficient for us to make a step. And then if we don't, learn and adapt. If it doesn't work the way you think it's going to work, learn and adapt and get better at this, because we urgently need to do this in order to ensure we build up our resilience, and also that we don't demonize failure. Right? If we fail, let's fail forward. Learn from why it is that we failed, develop a critique, figure out where the weaknesses are, solve them, and sort of pull up our bootstraps and go again. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll open up now for questions and answers. I'm not able to view anything online, so if there is an online question, I will depend on the people managing teams. Yes.
Ideological bias, how does one prevent that? Is it even possible?
So I think, as economists, this question of ideological bias, at least academic economists, is partly about firstly understanding sort of how the schools of thought impact upon our belief system. Okay, so schools of thought can often be something that is very, very useful because it can kind of clarify what it is you think will happen. The ideology becomes something where you think that everything should be explained by the theory. Okay? And then you might believe that one theory is more just than another, for example. And so it might be appealing to then say, well, we feel that Marxism is appropriate for the trade union movement because it's very much about redistributing wealth, about more fairness in society, right? But if you are owning a firm, you might feel that, well, you don't really want to do that because it takes so long to make a firm profitable that you're not necessarily going to behave the same way if you think that you're restricted in terms of how you can pay workers or how you can draw dividends out of the firm, etc. So different interest groups, and particularly political interest groups, will take a lot of those theories and make them ideological in an effort to win votes, because they will say that their way of doing things is fairer. But for research economists, that would not be an acceptable way in which to conduct research, because we really need to figure out what the real problems are and then boldly go and say, actually, you have to do the difficult things. Okay, so that's why economists are not very frequently liked in the room, because we'll have to kind of say, you have to cut down on health expenditure, or you have to cut down on expenditure on other things, because it's just not going to actually be what we need. So it's a fine line, and different interest groups will push different ideologies. But what we need to make sure we do is ensure that we remain sufficiently rigorous in our reasoning to not fall victim to the easy answers that ideology would offer. It's a great question.
Daniels, just a quick question. Are economists good communicators of policy implications? And if they aren't, why not? And what can they do to change that?
Okay, so it depends on the economist. Look, economists in academia are good at research, and the discipline that you need to do to get to a PhD and then have a successful academic career forces you to do that. And that doesn't mean you always communicate well, and your students will be the first to tell you that. So we at least get a lot of honest feedback about that. However, we don't always communicate well to policymakers. And that's a different form of communication. It often means you have to take technical documentation and you have to leave that aside, and you have to figure out how to communicate what the policy response is. And it's a different type of writing. You can't write with the same technical jargon. You very frequently need to then employ other people who can plain language your work in order to do that better. So there's no quick answer. Some economists are fantastic at doing it, even very technical economists. But it's a skill that needs to be developed. So yeah, we don't really focus on that in academia very much. But as soon as you do research work that brings or that raises or piques the interest of the policy community, you'll then be forced to learn how to do it. And it is a skill that needs to be invested in. Thanks, Cal. Justin.
Thank you, Prof. Daniels. I just wanted to ask in terms of the future, do you see a mismatch between the rate at which theory data develop in an AI world and the speed at which policy can be implemented and tested thereafter? Is there a bottleneck? Is it a structural issue that you think is going to happen in the future? What would you say?
Okay, so I'm personally optimistic about that for a couple of reasons. So let me explain why. In the work we did on the economics of waste, for example, one of the ways I learned about the missing gaps in the theory was through trying to develop what's called the general equilibrium model. So that uses, we use a lot of what called input-output data from Statistics South Africa, which maps industries, now they interrelate, to create a model where you can effectively experiment with introducing new policies and figuring out how they impact firms or individuals as employees, or also in terms of what they can do. I have a PhD student now who's looking at what happens when you have systematic environmental failure and its impact on the economy through a CGU model. Now, CGU models are partly based on neoclassical or Keynesian assumptions. But one of the reasons we do that is because they are computationally intensive and they force us to reason. They're also very expensive, though. But what seems to be a much more complex way of solving these issues is to use what the physicists and evolutionary biologists do, which is to develop complex evolutionary systems. So instead of thinking of economies in the traditional ways, We think of it as a complex adaptive evolutionary system, like an ecosystem, as an evolutionary biologist would. And there are a lot of models that do that now, but they're so data intensive that they require tens of millions of rands just to start, right? And then you still have to figure out how to do them. So the Center for Sustainable Transitions in the faculty is doing really important work here. They do have complexity theorists there. But the funding to get there, there's just the startup funding alone will be sort of in excess of 30 to 40 million rand to get these complexity models up and running. So one of the things I'm hopeful about is that AI is going to help reduce the cost as it begins to become more proficient with using Python in particular and navigating through R, which is open source, and now which it's got lots of capability in, that the cost of building those models with AI will be lower. And then you get much more powerful, much more realistic and complex models accessible to people, especially students and academics, at lower costs. So, AI is going to do a lot of good and bad things, but for research, it's potentially extremely powerful. It requires the vision, though, in order to say, we need to combine or develop specific or even bespoke AI systems to solve particular problems. And that's why we have Kanshu, the head of the data school, in the room, because he's going to help us do that at Stellenbosch University.
Hi. Thanks a lot, Professor Daniels. I don't want to get you into trouble, but if you had, so this is a question a little bit about your policy experience. If you had to guess or opine about which of the areas of policy that you think are most amenable to improvement via data and which ones are just sort of mired in intractable lobbying gridlock, right? Would you say it's environmental policy, it's financial regulation, it's labor market policy? Which are the areas where you think, like if you were controlling the budget of Stats SA, what would you prioritize relative to the status quo?
Okay, so first thing is outfund NIDS again. And that's not just because of partisanship, but you really need a longitudinal data set where you track the same people over time in order to understand how people are getting ahead or falling behind. That's Ingrid Woolard, the previous dean, her and Murray Leibrand, they were really crucial in getting the whole country to understand the value of a longitudinal data set. And so it's absolutely critical. But aside from that, we really urgently need to understand firm constraints. So, when you have electricity shortages, for example, and water shortages, nobody's going to invest, okay? Because you can't sustain the capital costs of a factory without a reliable supply of electricity and water. Okay, so if we don't get the basics right in South Africa, then a lot of other things that will allow us to sort of almost disproportionately grow are going to be disabled rather than enabled. So when it comes to policy, I think the very important thing that I've always tried to sort of say, which is not very complicated, is get the basics right. Infrastructure, right? Electricity, water, etc. Allow for rebates into the electricity system. So don't allow Eskom or other monopolies to block competition, because that kind of then opens up the market, as we've seen now with electricity and solar and wind. And so you want constant ways in which individuals in their own sort of entrepreneurial ways can actually find solutions to things, and you want to enable and scale, and then take away the policies that impede them from doing that. But if you are going to say, what are some of the key other policy questions, then it's very difficult to talk about environmental policies when you've got these massive wars taking place, right? Or reducing your carbon footprint when one bomb is going off, almost every hour on the hour in 3 or 4 different locations in the world. Because then any reduction in carbon by consumers is offset by these global wars. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it does mean that the impact of authoritarianism and conflict has dramatically negative consequences. It's that stuff that's going to lead us to the tipping points of climate change, right? Whether almost anytime you have a war, the impacts on the environment are going to be global and systemic. So those would be things where I think you really have to understand how political influence and power is going to constrain things there. Doesn't fully answer your question, but we could go on for a long time.
We can take, there were two hands, right? One more hand. Just say your name quickly so we can take the last two. Who else? So it was 1, 2, anyone else? Okay, there's one. Okay, so yeah. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Daniels. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Excuse me. So it would appear that these epistemological losses, given that they can happen amongst learned economists and those of us who enjoy looking at data, are even more likely to occur amongst the laymen or the voting public. And I'm sure even more often they're weaponized by political actors to push some form of a political agenda. So my question is, how can economists use data and theory and policy recommendation to mitigate these problems and losses amongst the public, not necessarily learned or academics, and further disempower these sort of malicious political actors?
So I don't think we can disempower malicious political actors. They will be malicious political actors. But what we can do is take responsibility for what we do, right? So academic economists, I think our responsibility is in particular to engage with the policy community, with our students in such a way where we point out how it can be weaponized, to use your words, and point out why and how you want to avoid that. And then it's up to the students, when you guys go into your places of employment, not to become the agents of malicious political conniving, and then to also resist, right? So how do we do that? We do that with individual agency, with showing students like the different ways in which you can uncover deeper epistemological meaning, and then the methods to get there. But you're right, those methods are complex. Still, the point here is that academia and public intellectuals in particular are very frequently commentators on what's happening. And one of the easy ways to get really good information is to follow academic economists who have public profiles that you trust. So Paul Krugman, for example, who won the Nobel Prize, he has a blog. There are other economists with political persuasions, from neoclassical to Marxist, that also have blogs. And just to read and see what they're saying and think about how you feel about it, given what you understand. And then talk to your lecturer about it and say, hey, but Krugman said this, what do you think? And that's the advantage of a university environment, right? That we are here to build critical thinking.
Okay, we'll take the copy on the left. Just quickly, your name and the question.
Good day, Prof. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. We often hear about government failure as a lack of capacity, but you also mentioned an inability to learn. In your research, what is the biggest institutional barrier that prevents governments from actually learning from policy outcomes?
Okay, that's a tough one. But a great question. So I suppose in some ways there can be some complex ones. So let me tell you, for example, there can be sometimes things that are a little bit hidden. So the Public Finance Management Act, for example, when it was introduced, it was a very rigorous way in which public finance should be tracked and managed, and it was designed to reduce corruption. For a lot of governments and local governments also, they often found themselves with the expenditure decisions being questioned, so much so that they then became too afraid to implement, because if there was any money that was mismanaged, they might be held accountable. And so frequently the process of delivering, which is at local government level, at director and above level within local government, might have been subcontracted to a consultant, for example. Okay, so under those conditions, you have good intentions of policy. The Public Finance Management Act is absolutely necessary. But without training bureaucrats on how to be compliant with financial policies through the expenditure that they do, you can often find that they will rather say, it's too risky for me, I'm going to step back, and we're going to subcontract delivery to a consultant. And then, of course, all kinds of other ways of capture then sneak into that process which hijack it. So, look, it's not always that there are bad intentions in government. I think most of the time there are very good intentions, but there are serious gaps, and financial literacy is a huge gap, because I think the ability to understand how to spend in a way that is auditable and how to ensure that that enables delivery is part of the bureaucrat's challenge, which isn't simple.
One hand there, so very quickly, short question and short answer. Yes. Sorry, the hand up in that row, 1, 2, 3 from the back. Do you have the mic? Just one max, please. Sorry, the mic flew to the other side. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the great lecture. I appreciate the encouragement to fail fast and learn from it.
No, fail forward. Not fail fast.
And that's, I suppose, my question is, what happens when the economists do get it wrong? I guess my question is there infrastructure for accountability in your field? And to what degree do you have faith in the solemnity that your peers approach something as impactful as public policy setting?
Yes, it's great question, complex to talk about in the many different ways in which economists work. But so one of the ways in which there are institutionalized level of accountability, for example, is through the Reserve Bank. Okay, so the Reserve Bank is responsible for setting monetary policy, which impacts upon our inflation, our interest rates, our currency level. And there, for example, the independence of the Reserve Bank to economists is as important as the independence of the judiciary to lawyers. You have to have the Reserve Bank governor and everyone in it free from political bias and undue ideological influence. Because if you don't, then you get what happens in Zimbabwe, where you print money. So that's the fastest way to destroy an economy, okay, is to have loss of accountability of your state actors because you violate the independence of the Reserve Bank. And it's almost the easiest governance one. So we have several institutions in South Africa that police what's going on inside of the major institutions that set policy. The South African Revenue Service is another one, and the National Treasury and the provincial treasuries are others. So very, very strong watchdog institutions there. The problem is, of course, in firms where you don't have that strong regulatory oversight. Right? And this is where you often see that you will have unethical behavior that goes unpunished, might even be rewarded. And banks and financial crises are often the ones most recently where you've seen that excessive levels of profitability, excessive remuneration rates, bonus structures, all kinds of hidden sort of collusion between banks and rating agencies and different investment products. So that was one of the reasons we got the financial crisis of 2008, which then spread globally. So yes, there's a lot of regulation around, but it's not always, and it's not even desirable at micro levels. Still, it then does become important that the institutions you do have need to exercise their authority and their regulatory power to rein in that unethical conduct.
So thank you very much once again, Professor Daniels, for the lecture and also for sharing. And I'm not sure how you balance that equation now. So what does when will the left-hand side be equivalent to the right-hand side?
When we have good epistemology.
Good epistemology, okay. So the data quality is important, and also the importance of having evidence-informed policies. and also longitudinal data, which we need to collect also in our context. I think our research usually tends to be in piecemeals, small research projects here and there. So we need to be thinking, I think from your lecture, I also take the importance of thinking about research which can have longer term impact, which also means that we need longitudinal data for different types of research that we do. So from my side, it's to say thank you so much on behalf of the Rectorate. I will not try to summarize because my colleague there, I think, summarized better from what she understood from the lecture, but also there are quite a number of questions. So thank you so much and congratulations. I'm supposed to ask Professor Janssen for the vote of thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
I'll be quick, I promise. It looks long, but it's not a very long list, so I'll try and finish within the next 5 minutes. So firstly, good evening, distinguished guests, members of the university leadership, colleagues, students, alumni, donors, family, and friends, and all of those joining us online. A special welcome and thanks to Professor Daniels' family for being here. We are delighted that you could join us for this significant milestone. This achievement is a celebration not only of Professor Daniels' accomplishments, but also of the support, encouragement, and sacrifices of those who have journeyed alongside him. It is my privilege to offer a few words of thanks as we conclude this evening's proceedings. Now, inaugural lectures occupy a special place in university life. They provide opportunity to celebrate academic achievement while also recognizing the broader contribution that a professor makes to students, colleagues, institutions, and society. They remind us that academic careers are measured not only by publications and research outputs, but also by the people we influence, the communities we serve, and the ideas we help shape. This evening, Reza has shared with us insights from a body of work that has consistently engaged with pressing economic and societal challenges facing South Africa and also globally. At the heart of this lecture was an important reminder that the relationship between data, theory, and policy is really as straightforward as we might hope. In a world increasingly driven by evidence and analytics, he challenged us to think carefully about what our data capture, what they miss, and what this means for the decisions we make. Now, for many academics, the pursuit of knowledge can become highly specialized. What has distinguished Reza's work is his commitment to ensuring that rigorous scholarship remains connected to real-world challenges and contributes meaningfully to improve lives. Through his research, leadership, and public engagement, he has consistently demonstrated that universities have a vital role to play in addressing the complex economic, social, and environmental issues of our time. Yet tonight is not only about celebrating scholarship. Professor Daniels, those of us who have the privilege of working with you, know that your contribution extends far beyond your impressive academic achievements. As a colleague, you exemplify the values of collegiality, intellectual curiosity, and services. As a leader, you help shape strategic conversations within our faculty and the university. As a mentor, you encourage and support students, staff, and emerging scholars, creating opportunities for others to flourish. The strength of any academic department or faculty ultimately lies in its people, and in the relationships that sustain a culture of learning and excellence. Your commitment to building those relationships, fostering collaboration and supporting colleagues will have a lasting impact on our community. For this, we are deeply grateful. So on behalf of the faculty, I would like to thank you for the many ways in which you have enriched Stellenbosch University already through your scholarship, your leadership, and service. We congratulate you wholeheartedly on reaching this important milestone, and we look forward to your continued contributions in the years ahead. I would also like to express our sincere appreciation to the members of the academic procession whose presence has honored this occasion. To our distinguished guests and the family members, colleagues, donors, collaborators, alumni, students, and friends, thank you for joining us this evening and sharing in this celebration. I also want to give a special word of thanks to the many people who worked behind the scenes to make tonight possible. We acknowledge the dedication and professionalism of all these staff members. Your efforts are greatly appreciated. In particular, I would like to thank from the Dean's Office, Amira Sonde, as well as Bernadette Peterson, for her support throughout the inaugural process to the Dean. And then the team from the Advancement Stakeholder Engagement and Communication Office, especially Amira Brown and her team. Thanks very much. Furthermore, I'd like to also thank Justin Alberts for his expert audiovisual guidance in ensuring our online audience can join us tonight. And finally, the Registrar's Responsibility Center, specifically Jonathan Dale Blankenberg, for managing the professional or the professorial inaugural lecture process from the very beginning. Thank you for ensuring that this significant occasion could be shared with us both here in person and online. Reza, congratulations once again, and on behalf of all of us gathered here, we really celebrate you this evening. We celebrate your achievements, and we thank you for the impact you continue to make in our faculty, our university, and society more broadly. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and I really hope that you will have a pleasant evening and enjoy the refreshments. And I invite you to stand and please rise for the academic procession that will be led by Professor Reza Daniels. Thank you.